Hello, my name is Robin Simpson and I'm a storyteller. Tonight I'm going to be telling you the story of the Prince and the Dragon. So make yourself comfortable, open up your lug holes and enjoy. Once upon a time, a very long time ago, not that far from Sefton in fact, there lived a king. And this king had 3 sons, princes. And the 2 eldest sons were fine young men. They were tall and they were strong and they were handsome. Oh, and they loved to go hunting. Scarcely a day would go by without one or the other of them riding out of the palace gates with hound and hawk and hunting horn. The youngest prince didn't really like hunting very much, but he loved to read. Most days, the youngest prince could be found in the palace library with his head in a book, learning about the world or reading a story. Well, one fine spring morning, the eldest son rode out of the palace gates on his favourite horse. We don't need to give the prince a name because he's not in the story much. And he rode with his hound and his hawk and his hunting horn. The eldest prince rode through the royal forest. He was in his element. He gave out a happy laugh. Ha 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 ha! And his hound gave a happy bark. And his hawk gave a happy squawk. And his horse gave a happy whinny. Just then, a hare ran out of a thicket onto the forest path in front of him. The hare spotted him and ran, fast as lightning, along the trail. The prince blew a happy note on his hunting horn and gave chase. Oh, the hare was fast, but the prince's horse kept pace with it. Over hill and dale they chased until, eventually, the hare took refuge in an old, abandoned mill by the side of a great river. This is the river we call today the Mersey. Surrounding the mill were many hundreds of young trees, saplings, lifeless and dead. The prince slowed his horse, dismounted, told his dog to stay, placed his hawk on the horse's head, and alone crept towards the old mill. He placed his hands on the old wooden door and pushed it open. And he went inside. It was dark and dusty inside the mill, and it took a while for his eyes to adjust to the gloom. But when they did, he saw the hare sitting in the middle of the floor, staring at him. Weird, thought the prince, moving towards it. But the hare was suddenly a hare no more. In its place stood a terrible dragon. And the prince turned to flee, but a long, fiery tongue coiled around his waist, and he was pulled into the dragon's mouth. And with a clomp of its jaws, the prince was gone. Back at the palace, the king and the other princes waited for him to return, but all that came through the palace gates that evening was the horse, the hound, and the hawk. Days passed, a month, and the people in the city grew uneasy. What on earth had happened to their prince? Well, some months later, the second brother decided to go out hunting. You never know, maybe he would find out what happened to his brother. So one fine summer morning, the second brother rode out of the palace gates. We don't need to give him a name either. You can probably guess why. He rode through the royal forest. He was in his element. He gave a happy laugh. Ha 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 ha! And his dog gave a happy bark. And his hawk gave a happy squawk. And his horse gave a happy whinny. Just then, a hare ran out of a thicket onto the forest path in front of him, just like before. The hare spotted him and ran as fast as lightning along the trail. The prince blew a happy note on his hunting horn and gave chase. Over hill and dale they chased until eventually the hare took refuge in the same old abandoned mill, surrounded by the trees by the side of the river Mersey. The prince slowed his horse, dismounted, told his dog to stay, placed the hawk on the horse's head, and alone walked towards the old mill. He placed his hands on the old mill's wooden door, and he pushed it slowly open. Creak! And he went in. When his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw the hare sitting in the middle of the floor, staring at him. Weird, thought the prince, moving towards it, but the hare was suddenly a hare no more. In its place stood a terrible dragon, and the long fiery tongue coiled out around the prince's waist, and he too was pulled into the dragon's mouth with a clomp of its jaws. The second prince was gone. That evening all that came through the palace gates was his hawk, his horse, and his hound. Days went by, and the king couldn't sleep with worry about what had happened to his two eldest sons. Months went by, and eventually the youngest prince asked the king to go out hunting. Maybe he could find out what happened to his two older brothers. But the king said, "No, you don't even like hunting. What happens if you don't come back?" But the prince asked so often, he begged, he promised to be so careful, that the king eventually relented. And one fine autumn morning, the young prince rode out of the palace gates. And we can name this prince because he's the hero of our story. And his name is Alfred. He was given a horse and a hawk and a hound and a hunting horn. He didn't really know what to do with any of them. They belonged to his brothers. And his horse riding was terrible. Ugh. Well, I think you can guess what happens next. That's right. A hare ran out in front of him. The dog gave a happy bark. The hawk gave a happy squawk. The horse gave a happy whinny. And he gave chase over hill and dale. He chased that hare until eventually they arrived at the old abandoned mill by the river. Well, the hare dashed inside the mill, but Alfred slowed his horse to a stop and dismounted. He didn't go in the mill after the hare. He didn't know why, but he had this horrible suspicion that this spot was where his two brothers had vanished. Alfred waited and waited. All night he waited, and nothing came in or out of the mill. As dawn broke the next day, he left his horse, hound and hawk by the river, and he pushed open the wooden door. It was gloomy inside. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he could see an old woman. "What happened to my hair?" asked Alfred. "That was no hare," replied the old woman. "That was a dragon in disguise. Oh, it has led many a person here to devour them." The prince's heart sank as he realized what must have happened to his brothers. "I was once a witch," the old lady continued, "until the dragon captured me and made me his slave. I cannot escape until the dragon is destroyed." Now, Alfred was a brave young lad, so he said, "I will destroy the dragon." "And how might you do that?" Alfred thought for a moment, and then he said, "When the dragon comes back, ask him where he goes to when he's not here. Oh, and also ask him what makes him so strong." Well, the witch agreed, and Alfred left the mill, promising to return the next day. That evening, the dragon returned.
"Well, witch,"
he roared.
"has anyone been to the mill today?"
No, not that I know of. Where have you been all day?"
"I have travelled far,"
the dragon answered. The old witch decided to flatter him because, well, everyone knows dragons are vain creatures.
"Oh, you must be really strong to fly all that way."
"I am really strong, actually."
The witch thought, "This is working."
"You must be the strongest dragon of all. How did you get to be so strong?"
Flattered, the dragon answered,
"Inside me is a boar, and inside the boar is a hare, and inside the hare is a pigeon, and inside the pigeon is a sparrow, and inside the sparrow is my strength. Every day I have to fly back to my home, an island far out in the ocean, to regain my strength. But don't tell anyone.
Oh, I won't.
Well, of course she did, the next morning, when Alfred returned to the mill. Alfred vowed to destroy the beast and free the witch from whichever spell was binding her to the dragon, and with that he set off. Later that day he arrived at the seafront. The waves were crashing on the shore. The seagulls were calling to one another. The young prince left his horse at a stable, and with his hound and his hawk he went down to the harbour to see if he could find a ship that might take him out to the distant island. He spoke to the captain.
"Well, ships that go that way have a habit of not returning,"
said the captain.
"Bad things live out to sea that way."
But the prince persuaded the captain, and the ship rowed out of the harbour and then set sail for the distant, unknown island. For days they sailed towards the setting sun, until eventually, "Land ahoy!" called the sailor up in the crow's nest. Looking through his telescope, the captain saw an island rising from the sea. It was the island we today call the Isle of Man, but in those days it had no name. It was bare of trees and seemed to be smoking as if it had been burned regularly. "That'll be it," said Alfred. Alfred, his dog and his hawk got into a rowing boat and they set off to find the dreadful dragon. When he arrived, he was relieved to find the place empty, as the dragon had not yet returned from the mill. Alfred hid behind a rock and waited for nightfall for the dragon to return. And return it did. After the sun had set, bellowing fire into the sky, the dragon landed on the smoky ground. But then something amazing happened. The dragon's skin split open, and a great boar stepped out. And then out of the boar's mouth leapt a hare, and then from the hare flew a pigeon, and from the pigeon flew a little sparrow. Alfred wasted no time. He didn't want the dragon to regain its strength. He jumped up from behind the rock and he blew on his hunting horn. And his dog gave a happy bark. And the dog chased down the boar. And as soon as the dog leapt on the boar, it vanished in a puff of smoke. And the dog chased down the hare. And the same thing happened. And the hawk gave a happy squawk. And it chased down the pigeon. And the pigeon vanished in a puff of smoke. All that was left was the sparrow, and the hawk clasped the tiny sparrow in its claws and dropped it into Alfred's waiting hands. And to his amazement, the sparrow spoke to him, and it said,
"If you let me go, I'll release your brothers back to you."
"Well, all right then," said Alfred. "I'll let you go if I can get my brothers back. How do I do that?" And the sparrow replied,
"By the old mill are many hundreds of saplings. Each one is a person I have eaten. If you pull the saplings out of the ground, each person will come back to life."
Well, Alfred kept his promise. He let the sparrow go. Never again would it become an evil, people-eating, fire-breathing dragon. Alfred wasted no time in travelling, first by sea and then by land, back to the mill. And there was the old witch waiting for him. "Thank you for giving me my freedom," she said, smiling, and she vanished in a puff of smoke. But the prince wasn't quite finished. The last thing he did before he returned home was pull up every sapling from around the mill. As the roots of each and every one came out of the ground, a person would appear, blinking in the sunlight and giving thanks. Hundreds of people, men, women, children, all once devoured by the dragon, came back to life that day, including Alfred's 2 older brothers. They were so delighted to see him again. as was the king when they returned home. And that's the end of my story. I hope you enjoyed it.